This section will deal with the strategies, adaptations, and methods that pertain to CVI, especially in phase 1. But before we talk specifically about phase 1, there are just a couple things I'd like to mention that apply to all 3 of the phases. First of all, it's important that we be very careful about generalizations. When we talk about interventions and strategies for kids with CVI, we need to remember that the interventions apply to individuals with CVI who span all ages, all levels of ability and disability, and who may have acquired CVI around the time of birth or at a later time. So there are really 2 broad categories of CVI: those who have it from around the time of birth and those who have acquired CVI from an injury or incident that occurs later. We're talking about all of those children in this presentation. So regardless of the diversity of the group of individuals with CVI, and you see on this slide that there are, kids of all different sizes and shapes and colors, and it's really there to remind us that this is a diverse group of children, that some of these children will walk and talk and have a sense of humor and tease us and tell us jokes, and other children will have difficulty with expressive language at all. Some children will have seizures. Some children will be neurologically stable. But they all have this one thing that holds them together, and that is the set of visual and behavioral characteristics. That if you think of kind of like all the little gems along the string that make the necklace, the gems might vary, but the thing that really ties them together are these characteristics. They are the common thread. So children with CVI have complex needs. But really, designing interventions for children with CVI is not that complicated. I'm always fascinated by the fact that people want to, when they talk about children with CVI, they have difficulty coming up with specific information, with detailed plans, with ways that you can infuse actual language about interventions into IEPs. And I'm always a little confused by that because I don't really think it's that complicated. Again, the needs of children with CVI may be complicated, but when it comes to CVI, if you have the language, if you have the key, those pieces that are the characteristics, if you've done a careful assessment, you actually have the decoder for how to understand children with CVI. So as I say, don't tell anyone, but it's really not that complicated. So interventions for children with CVI, again, must be based on an assessed level of CVI. I have said that every time we have recorded one of these sessions, and I will say it probably for any others that you listen to, because it is that critical. The interventions must be individualized. There isn't a big book of interventions from which you can just look up 15 and share them with the child. They really are individualized because they are paired with meaningful routines of the day in that child's life, especially the children in phase 2 and phase 3 who are really engaged in vision plus function. It's also important to remember that the objects and materials selected for phase 1 must be able to be applied to the methods and materials and adaptations to the higher phases. So if you remember the conversations we had about this, can't be something about a light box and something about a pom-pom. Rather, it has to be really directed. So then you might say, but in phase 1 we do use a light box, we do use a pom-pom. And the real core of this lies in your intention. This slide, which says that the materials you select for phase 1 must be able to be applied to the materials, the methods, and the adaptations to the higher phases. So whenever I select something in phase 1, knowing that the child only has to look, I have to be convinced in my mind that I know how I'm going to apply this to the higher phases. This picture shows a swan who is, diving for something to eat underwater, and all you see is the tail end of the swan in the water. And I say here that unfortunately, this swan picture reminds me of what we sometimes may have a tendency toward in planning interventions. And unfortunately, sometimes a professional's head is actually underwater, but maybe not with the same intention that this swan has its head underwater. There are individuals who let the materials, not the range score, drive the interventions. So again, just because you go to the dollar store and there's a lot of cool, shiny, moving, light up things, they shouldn't necessarily be given to a specific child unless you know that they match the child's color need, their need for light, their need for low complexity. If this object lights up but has multiple colors and makes a big whirring noise, is that really a phase 1 target? Probably not. So sometimes it does become that light box and pom-pom mistake, and our job here is to try to make sure we stay on the right path. The intentionality of the design is critical. So if I'm with somebody who's designing a program for a child with CVI, we will engage in a conversation about those phase 1 materials, and I might ask, so tell me, if you're using this gold mylar shiny pom-pom with this child in phase 1, can you tell me how that's going to turn into something for phase 2 and maybe even phase 3? If the person can't answer that, we probably have to go back to the drawing board. So this slide shows a red pom-pom that's shiny, and it says that we should intentionally plan, and that is really the key word here, that it's all about our intentionality. That in phase 1, you see this object is red, which is the characteristic of color. It is shiny, the characteristic of movement. It is a non-complex target, which has to do with complexity of the surface of the object. And it is non-noise producing. It is only a visual input, which addresses complexity of the sensory environment. So again, this object on its surface looks like a so what object, but I know where I'm going with this. The next slide shows how in phase 2, the vision plus function phase, how that red pom-pom can be sort of morphed into or transitioned into the things that we will use for vision plus function. This is a picture of a simple red cup. It could be a red toothbrush, a red switch that the child uses, a red spoon. But the concepts around simple, red, non-complex, non-noisy target are clearly there. So our intentionality rules hold. Here's a slide showing a red switch, a red spoon, and a red toothbrush. In other words, things that meet the criteria as that child transitions into phase 2 that actually have a lot to do with the material chosen from phase 1. This picture shows a strip of red tape at the edge of a door. This is for a child who might be in phase 2 or possibly even phase 3 who is attempting to locate a certain place within a classroom. In this case, it's a bathroom door. This is here intentionally to help draw the child's attention with a color, simple, non-complex, non-noisy adaptation that has a lot to do with that red pom-pom. In phase 3, that red pom-pom might become these things. We're going to think about color, low complexity again, and they're maybe now added to or applied to adaptations or methods or materials again. So here you see a children's book of Elmo, and you see there are a number of elements in the unadapted picture at the top, but at the bottom, the picture of Elmo has been separated from the background and placed on its own non-complex background. Also has a lot to do with the red pom-pom from the beginning. The next slide shows 3 adaptations that would be iterations or generations away from what we started in phase 1, but now for a child in phase 3. So you see a red shiny target that is placed at several places in this hallway. This is the child's classroom hallway, their school hallway. And these targets now that are very much like those original red pom-poms are placed at distances that are a little challenging, but still within the ability level of the child in phase 3 to help indicate or guide the child to another salient feature of their world, their classroom door. You see that there's an adaptation here on an iPad which shows red highlighting to help teach salient features of the cat's pointy or triangle-shaped ears, and the red highlighting of their whiskers, salient features that help the child understand that even though they may not have seen this picture of a cat, that this is still a part of cat scheme. And finally, there's a picture of a math paper for a child with CVI in which red, or in this case bright orange reddish color, was applied to the places where the child puts the answers to the problems, because without that adaptation, the child's answers and writing is just all over the page. So this helps anchor her to the proper place to perform the task of this math paper. Another example, this is an intentional choice in phase 1 of a child who maybe one of the first things they would look at was a yellow slinky. And you think, again, how does a yellow slinky ever, what is the purpose? What is the meaning? How is this important in a child's life? In this child, we have, in this case, on this slide, we see that single color, low complexity, and no additional sensory input is again featured because of phase 1. At this point in phase 1, all the child has to do is watch the movement of that simple yellow target against a black background. But in phase 2, the principles of yellow and movement and simple are applied with vision plus function. You could still actually use that slinky, and it could transition with that child into phase 2 as something to interact with. This shows a picture of a simple yellow pinwheel. Again, low complexity, movement, no noise. It could be, however, the child's yellow cup. It could be yellow highlighting near a doorway, or at the edge of a seat, or at a table, or some other place in their environment where they need to actually direct their attention. This slide shows 3 images of a child whose preferred color originally was yellow, in which this child is interacting with a yellow switch on a black background. There's a choice of a yellow cup, and if you see at the bottom, there's a picture here of a little boy who's using a switch to activate a light that points at a mirror ball. And this is how this little boy is learning color, that the movement on this mirror ball, plus the light, plus the shininess, and the low complexity of it makes it perfect. So as the child gazes up, they're actually looking away from the complexity of the classroom up to a part of the environment that is non-complex, which is the ceiling. That's how this little boy learned colors. In phase 3, the use of color and low complexity, again, are applied to the adaptations, methods, and materials. You can see in this picture that there's somewhere on that complex array, there's a little yellow banana hiding, and this is a kind of a classic phase 3 task. But you see also some images on this slide of a picture of a yellow cup paired with the word cup that is highlighted in terms of the salient features of that word. You see some pre-literacy things with the child using light and color to learn letter shape and to learn salient features, both on lighted backgrounds. So again, interventions for children with CVI are an approach, not a therapy. They are an adaptation to things across the day. Remember that vision improvements occur through the eyes. They do not occur, in my opinion, and based on the research we completed at Pediatric View, they do not occur just by the passage of time. That what we do as that powerful mediator in that child's life has everything to do with improvement. That interventions must be paired with functional, meaningful routines and reward. The reward of being able to hit a switch to turn on the music, being able to reach out and touch something to make it spin or activate. We create adaptations and activities that incorporate those CVI characteristics at, not above, not below, the assessed level. I think of this as that just right place. I also sometimes think of this as like the child's corrective lenses for CVI. That we wouldn't give a child corrective lenses that were too powerful or too weak because they would be useless. Rather, we look for that refraction, that correction that matches that child's refractive error so that they have access. Glasses alone don't make a difference. A light box alone doesn't make a difference. It's what we do that matches that child's assessed level that makes all the difference. So we examine the daily routines in the schedule, the time of the day, the activity of that day, and the adaptations. I always suggest dividing the opportunities into quarters. So you think of the day divided into quarters, make sure that there are at least 2 opportunities in each of those quarters because frequency is important. Now, more opportunities is even better. But in order to avoid the sense of almost being overwhelmed at how am I going to analyze this child's entire day, we don't have to start there. We can start with dividing the child's entire day into quarters, and we can look at We can look at, the child's waking time, their breakfast time, when they first get into school, putting their backpack in a cubby or on a hook. It can be spread out across the day, and starting with the frequency that at least includes 2 opportunities within each quarter. So the CVI schedule might look something like this. This has actually been an intervention technique that has been quite successful in meeting this end. Also seems to be paired pretty well with an itinerant model, one in which a teacher of the visually impaired or other person who's in charge of the child's CVI programming doesn't have to be hovering over the team all day or the child, but rather can meet with the team, gather the team and say, let's look at what happens first, second, third, fourth, fifth in the day. Can we make an adaptation to this? If so, what should that look like? So that we are now all taking responsibility for our various therapies and are creating opportunities that are natural and that fit into the routine and the curriculum. So this one shows at 8:45 a.m. the child moves from the bus to the classroom. We're going to look at the characteristics of color and movement and low complexity needs. And maybe the adaptation is that we're going to add red mylar or shiny markers to the corners and to the classroom door. Another example shows that at 10:15, it's fine motor time. We're going to look at color and complexity and movement and latency. The suggestion here is that we're going to select red, shiny materials for the fine motor activity, add some wait time for latency before we expect the child to respond. At noon, it may be lunchtime, again looking at color and complexity and now novelty. Perhaps this time now we're going to add that a certain red spoon, red dish, and black tray are used to help draw the child's attention to these targets. Perhaps at 2:30 it's music time, and the child loves music, as many children with CVI do. And maybe during this time, the team decides this is a time that would be so highly variable. The routines in music maybe are so variable, and the child is so completely drawn into the sound that maybe for now we're not going to make an adaptation to music. That's okay. We've accounted for that. It's intentional. This is an example of the same kind of a thing from the Bridge School, who have developed their own format for finding ways to integrate these routines into the day. And they show here how they're going to have some student considerations, like the student looks at simple 3D objects presented one at a time against a plain background. Then the teacher considerations describe what the image should look like and what the exact salient features will be that are used for language purposes and helping to feed cognition. They have a column that includes environmental considerations and a column that describes what alternative augmentative communication or technology will be used to help the child access this from a language point of view. So they talk about increasing descriptive vocabularies, increasing visual engagement with surroundings. So that's another version of how they tackled this CVI schedule. In both cases, it is never random. It is always planned to make sure that this frequency of opportunity to use vision occurs. Because again, vision improvements occur through the eyes. And if the child is simply staring up at the ceiling, there isn't a lot of improvement. There aren't many opportunities for improvement. So beginning in phase 1, we'll take a moment now and just talk about specifically those principles around phase 1. Remember that dorsal stream or where vision dominates. This is not a child who yet has a fixation response, but rather they kind of notice something to the side of them. So that dorsal stream vision dominates. We're going to think about paying it forward. Again, materials selected for phase 1 should be able to apply to the future phases. What is the purpose? Objects for viewing should ideally extend from the eye to the hand in phase 1, that we want the target to not just be up here in their visual world, but also be able to extend downwards so that the child actually, if they even accidentally encounter it, can begin to make the cognitive connection that this thing I see and this thing that my hand touches, they might be the same thing. So we're actually beginning this in a very primitive way as a pre-literacy activity. Remember that a light box or flashlight is not a standalone item. So in this framework, we do not ask a child to track a light 15 or 20 times because that is not really paired with a functional routine. Also, the environment in phase 1 has no visual distractors, no auditory distractors. Color, light, movement must be present for all interactions. The child has brief, fleeting localizations. Preferred objects are most useful. Ask the parent, maybe ask the teacher, what does Joey always seem to notice? Is there anything he notices? Start with that. Latency occurs frequently, so don't be disappointed, don't be discouraged, don't be confused if it takes a long, long time for the child to turn in the direction. That is really inherent to phase 1. So some of the materials in phase 1, again, are these simple things. So I show here a red shiny pom-pom, kind of a bizarre thing when you think about what we're trying to do for education. But it's really not, because I know exactly how I'm going to use this material going forward. Again, an example of a simple, non-noisy yellow pom-pom. If the parent says, my child only looks at Big Bird, I might select something like this as something that's pretty similar to Big Bird or Big Bird himself to get started. And finally, this is that place. I show an image here of these gold shiny beads. This is the place where the gold, red, blue, green, purple, whatever the child's preferred color is, has a place. Very often I see kids for years being offered shiny beads. And I always wonder why. Why have they not progressed on? And perhaps they have. Because these shiny things that are simple and don't make a lot of noise are really, really restricted to phase 1 or early phase 2, where you could possibly reach out and swat at those to make them move. Or where I know I have the intention of adding gold mylar to the cup, to the toothbrush, to other things that happen and the child encounters in the day. But there is nothing inherently useful about gold beads that travel with a child throughout their school career. It is a tool, it is a launching place that we intentionally may select that is restricted primarily to phase 1. Thank you.